Look at any country that has become genuinely wealthy in the last 200 years. Britain, the United States, Japan, South Korea, Singapore, China more recently. Different continents, different cultures, different political systems. Some democracies, some authoritarian states, some somewhere in between. And yet, strip away the surface differences, and every single one of them did the exact same thing to get rich. Not similar things, the same thing, and almost nobody talks about what it actually was, because the real answer makes a lot of popular economic advice look incomplete at best. Here is the pattern, and once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it everywhere. Let's start with Britain, because Britain is where the modern industrial economy was effectively invented. In the late 1700s, Britain did not simply open its markets and let free trade work its magic. It did something far more deliberate. It protected its own textile industry behind steep tariffs while it was still young and inefficient. British wool and cotton manufacturers were shielded from foreign competition, particularly from India, which at the time actually produced higher quality textiles at lower cost. The economic historian Ha-Joon Chang has documented this extensively. Britain used tariffs, subsidies, and outright bans on competing imports to nurture its own industries until they became globally dominant. Only once British manufacturers could outcompete everyone else did Britain start preaching free trade to the rest of the world. By then, free trade overwhelmingly favored Britain because Britain had already built the strongest industrial base on the planet, using the opposite of free trade to get there. This is sometimes called kicking away the ladder. You climb up using protection and state support. Then, once you're at the top, you tell everyone else that the ladder was never necessary and that open markets were the secret all along. Now look at the United States. The same playbook, almost exactly. Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary, wrote a document in 1791 called the Report on Manufactures. In it, he argued explicitly that the young United States needed tariffs and government support to build domestic industry, because American manufacturers could not yet compete with established British producers. Congress adopted these ideas. Throughout the 1800s, the U.S. maintained some of the highest tariff rates in the world, often above 40% on manufactured goods. This was not a minor detail. Economic historian Paul Bayrock found that the United States was, for much of the 19th and early 20th century, the most protectionist developed economy in the world. American steel, textiles, and manufacturing grew up almost entirely behind a wall of tariffs that kept cheaper foreign goods out, giving domestic producers time and space to become globally competitive. Only after World War II, when American industry dominated the planet, did the U.S. become the world's leading advocate for free trade. The pattern again: protect first, preach free trade later. Japan's post-war transformation followed an almost identical script, just compressed into a few decades instead of a century. The Japanese Ministry of International Trade and Industry, known as MITI, did not simply step back and let markets decide which industries would grow. MITI identified strategic sectors: steel, shipbuilding, automobiles, and later electronics, and directed capital, protected them from foreign competition, and pushed Japanese companies to compete aggressively in export markets once they were strong enough. The economist Chalmers Johnson, who studied this extensively, called Japan a developmental state. The government was not hands-off. It was deeply, deliberately hands-on, picking industries to support and shielding them from premature exposure to global competition. South Korea took this even further. In the 1960s, South Korea was poorer than many African nations. Today, it is home to Samsung, Hyundai, and LG. The economist Alice Amsden documented how the South Korean government under Park Chung-hee directed credit towards specific export industries, protected domestic markets from imports, and explicitly violated what would now be called free market principles, all in service of building globally competitive companies as fast as possible. China's rise over the last 4 decades is, in many ways, the most extreme version of this same pattern. State-directed credit, protected domestic markets, currency management, and aggressive industrial policy aimed at specific sectors. China did not get rich through laissez-faire capitalism. It got rich through one of the most deliberately managed economic development strategies in modern history. So here is the uncomfortable question this pattern raises. If every country that became rich did this, why is developing countries today routinely told the opposite? Why does the standard advice handed to poorer nations, often through institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, emphasize trade liberalization, removing tariffs, and opening markets to foreign competition immediately? This is not a fringe observation. Ha-Joon Chang has built much of his academic career around exactly this contradiction, arguing that wealthy nations effectively demand that developing countries follow rules the wealthy nations themselves never followed when they were developing. To be fair, this is genuinely contested among economists. Some argue that the global economy today is different enough from the 1800s that old protectionist strategies would not work the same way now. Global supply chains are more interconnected. Technology moves faster. The economist Jagdish Bhagwati spent much of his career arguing that openness and free trade, even for developing economies, tends to produce better outcomes than protection, and that some historical successes attributed to protectionism actually happened despite it, not because of it. There is also a real difference between protecting an industry strategically, with a clear plan to eventually compete globally, and protecting an industry indefinitely, which can create inefficient, uncompetitive companies that never have to improve. Several countries that tried protectionist strategies in the 20th century, particularly in Latin America during the import substitution era, ended up with exactly that problem: protected industries that never became globally competitive, just permanently subsidized. So the honest version of this story is not simply protectionism good, free trade bad. It is more specific than that. The countries that succeeded combined protection with intense pressure to perform. South Korean companies were protected at home, but the government set strict export targets and would withdraw support from companies that failed to compete internationally. The protection was a tool with an expiration date, not a permanent shelter. What nearly every successful case shares is this: governments actively shaped which industries grew, using tariffs, subsidies, directed credit, and trade barriers during the early vulnerable stages of development. And only after their industries became globally competitive did these countries open their markets and start promoting the textbook version of free trade to everyone else. The strategy was never simply work hard and let markets sort it out. It was protect strategically, build capacity deliberately, and open up only once you can win, which raises one more question worth sitting with. The next time you hear a wealthy nation or a global institution telling a developing country exactly how to structure its economy, it might be worth asking a simple thing. Is this the same path that nation took to get rich? Or is it the opposite?